shouldn't matter.
Well, thank you for calling in today. This is the Illinois Shines Adjustable Block Program Stakeholder Webinar. My name is Brian Gower. I'm a program administrator with Incline. For today's agenda, we will be covering designee registration, closing of small DG blocks and maintenance of the DG waitlists, revisions to distributed generation and CS marketing guidelines, the program guidebook, revised community solar disclosure forms, requests for feedback on community solar project diversity criteria and updating REC prices, community solar waitlist publishing process, what's next for the adjustable block program, and stakeholder questions. This meeting will be recorded, and the presentation and recording of this meeting will be posted on the Illinois Shines and Adjustable Block Program websites. So just to cover a couple points on the designee registration that was also covered on our previous training about 45 days ago. Who needs to register as an approved vendor designee? Section 6.9.1 of the IPA revised long-term plan created a new requirement for approved vendor designees to register with the adjustable block program. All third-party entities that have direct interaction with end-use customers of and that operate within Illinois, the Illinois Adjustable Block Program needs to register as an approved vendor designee, including entities performing system maintenance and ongoing O&M for small and large distributed generation systems. A full presentation of the approved vendor designee registration process was recorded in October 2020 and posted to the illinoisadp.com under resources, approved vendors, and approved vendor training materials. All designees that work within the adjustable block program must complete the designee registration no later than Thursday, December 10th, which was 45 days from the release of the functionality, Monday, October 26th, 2020. So the deadline to register is December 10th, that's tomorrow. Any new designees must register with the program prior to working with the approved vendor. Failure by a designee to comply with the applicable program requirements could subject the designee to disciplinary action, including suspension from the program. If a designee ignores a suspension decision made by the program administrator and continues its market activity nonetheless, any approved vendor or designee that works with the designee during that period may be subject to disciplinary action. Approved vendors and designees found to be working with entities that fail to register as designees with the program may be subject to disciplinary action. At this time, I'll hand off the presentation to my colleague, Alex Rain.
Thanks, Brian. This is Alex Ryan with Incline, tackling some of the additional topics on our webinar today. So first off, small DG blocks and waitlists. As you all or most of you may be aware, the small DG blocks are winding down. The Group A small DG block 3 closed as of December 3rd and is on a waitlist right now. Group B small DG block 3 has a hair over 3 megawatts of capacity remaining. The protocol for closing these blocks is that on the day that capacity is reached, submitted batches can continue to be allocated to block 3 until one of two things happens first. An additional 2 megawatts is submitted over the block capacity, or midnight that day is reached. That's the protocol that was followed for the closing of Group A, small DG Block 3, and will be followed for Group B, small DG Block 3 as well. And then with respect to the maintenance of the DG wait lists, we will soon be posting small DG wait lists for Group A. Currently, the large DG wait lists are posted, have been posted for some time. The next application on the relevant waitlist gets selected as applications are allocated based on applications being withdrawn ahead of them and sufficient capacity opens up. So it is not a one-to-one project-to-project relationship, it's a capacity relationship. As soon as that capacity opens up, the next project on the list is able to be taken. And applications that have been selected from the waitlist have 10 business days to accept their selection and will then move forward with either Block 3 pricing for small DG or Block 4 pricing for large DG. We recently posted distributed generation and community solar marketing guidelines, revised versions of these. The DG marketing guidelines were posted middle of September, and the community solar marketing guidelines middle of November. Both are available on the program website for you to take a look at. Some highlights from these marketing guidelines that I'll mention here, just kind of running down the list. Clarification on what can be posted or advertised, marketed regarding free and no cost solar offers. Clarifications on savings guarantees. So customer savings guarantees are allowed, but only if the customer contract explicitly includes that savings guarantee. There's also a new logo that approved vendors and designees can request from the program administrator to be used on marketing materials, and it includes that approved vendor or designee's adjustable block program ID. There are some conditions regarding the use of testimonials, and I know we had received a question from a stakeholder about the difference between testimonials and reviews left on public forums. The difference being that a review left on a public forum is something that someone else has said about you and not something that you are able to control, whereas including a testimonial in a piece of marketing is about how you represent yourself in your own marketing materials. There's some new information as well on social media posts. They must include information on the company that's providing the underlying offer, so it can be traced back to them. And there's an explanation for the disciplinary process and determinations. There's also an updated disclosure form process for community solar. We'll touch base on that in a little bit. And the prohibition on door-to-door solicitation remains in place until further notice. Would anyone from the IPA like to chime in with some more color on that? Anthony Starr or Brian Granahan?
Sure, this is Brian. Can you hear me okay, Alex?
We can, yeah.
Yeah, you know, when we last issued our update, again, reiterating that this door-to-door sales prohibition remains in place. I think positivity rates in Illinois for COVID-19, the percentage of positive tests across all tests offered were, I believe, 3.5%. They've since been consistently above 10%. The surge that has hit the nation in COVID-19 has been felt especially hard here in Illinois. So we don't think this would be an appropriate time, certainly, to lift this prohibition on door-to-door sales and solicitation. You know, as this situation evolves, we'll go ahead and reconsider it. But at this time, the prohibition remains in place and will remain in place for the foreseeable future.
Thanks, Brian. All right, turning to our next slide on the program guidebook. A revision to the program guidebook also was published recently, November 18th, so just a few weeks ago now. To call out some highlights from the changes that were put in the revised guidebook. The DC-AC ratio maximum previously was 1.5. It's now been raised to 1.55. We had received a number of exception requests that went up to approximately 1.55, so it made sense for us to increase this threshold. Also, the removal of the small subscriber adder for more than 75% small subscribership for community solar projects has been removed, but that's only for community solar projects that are approved by the ICC after February 18th of this year, 2020. Any community solar projects that were approved by the ICC prior to that date still retain the ability to achieve that 75% or greater small subscriber adder. There's some additional explanation and clarifications on the confidentiality of community solar subscribers' information and how that information needs to be treated. And similar to the marketing guidelines, there's an explanation of the disciplinary process, repercussions of suspension, and how a disciplinary decision can be appealed. There's also some new information on the status of equipment. So equipment used in the construction of a solar project that would like to be eligible for the adjustable block program must be new, or the age and the warranty of any repurposed equipment has to be disclosed to the customer. A shading study is no longer required. Those folks who have been submitting applications for a bit, I'm sure have found out that. Standard capacity factors are no longer used as well. They were removed from the revised long-term plan, and so they've been removed now from the program guidebook. Some arrays with some more extreme azimuths or tilts. So azimuths greater than 270 or less than 90, or a tilt greater than 80 may be subject to further review. The metering standards have been updated as well. So the MRET standards now match the PJM GAT standards as far as what kind of revenue grade metering is required for various sizes of applications. There's a new batching process that we had announced a number of months ago and are getting ready to roll out shortly. There's an explanation of that process, and we'll be providing more information in the coming weeks as we roll that out. As Brian mentioned earlier, we have a new designee registration process that launched about a month and a half ago, with the deadline being tomorrow for designees to register. There's an explanation of the designee types and the background of the designee registration requirement in the program guidebook now. And then some procedures around changing approved vendors and assignments. The assignment procedure hasn't changed, but we've incorporated that into the guidebook for archival purposes and clarity. Would anyone from the IPA like to provide any additional color on any of the items in the slide or anything else they'd like to call out?
Sure, this is Anthony Starr. The majority of the changes to the guidebook are really updating the guidebook to conform with the revised long-term plan. So many of the things that you'll see in there are things that have been in place, or for example, around assignments, we've previously published guidance on that. And so most of the changes to the guidebook really are codification of existing policies and procedures. But if there are open questions about that at the end of the presentation, obviously we'll be happy to answer those.
Great, thanks, Anthony. All right, next slide, please. Okay, we are on the revised community solar disclosure form. So as indicated before, a revised community solar disclosure form is anticipated to be available for use next month. That would be January 2021. Yesterday, I believe it was, we published a template that, to give an idea to approved vendors, designees, stakeholders, to give an idea of what the disclosure form will look like once it's completed. It represents one particular walkthrough of the form. So other versions of the form will look a little bit different with different questions and some blocks of text hidden or included, but that's one walkthrough just to give you an idea of what it will look like. Overall, it's been shortened, streamlined. The Community Solar informational brochure is now included as the first 2 pages of this revised disclosure form, so it doesn't need to be provided separately. The net cash flow estimate section of the disclosure form has been changed to more of a narrative that outlines how customers can estimate the value of a subscription through a comparison to the supply rates through their relevant provider. We now have 2 options for project identification in this revised disclosure form as well. So a project can be specified in the disclosure form that a particular subscriber will be subscribing to this known project. And this is typically how we've done it before. A new option is to be determined. So a project can be identified downstream. So the Community Solar disclosure form can be filled out without specifying a project, but the Community Solar provider must follow up downstream with the customer regarding the project that they ultimately get subscribed to once they have that information. And then there are now 2 options for generating the disclosure form. One is within the AB portal, as has been done historically and everyone is used to. The second is new. It's outside the Adjustable Block Program portal and it's done via API. So this has to contain the same content as if the disclosure form was generated within the ABP portal and meet any other requirements the program administrator develops to make sure that the form integrity is maintained and that its execution is consistent. This can only be done via API. So if you have the ability and the interest in pursuing this, it's not available yet. It will be available after the disclosure form has been released, but feel free to reach out to us and we can connect you with our development team at the program administrator that can get you set up with a sandbox in the API so you can start trying to figure out how that might work. And one last clarification, the Community Solar disclosure form must be delivered to and signed by the customer before the subscription contract is signed. Anthony, Brian, anything to add?
Sure, I guess I would just add a technical note that API is a programming interface that can be used to communicate information between systems. So a number of vendors are currently using it to exchange information with Inclime. If you're one of the vendors who has sophistication to use that, then as Alex said, you can follow up with Inclime for more information on how that process works. This is something that was in response to some of the feedback we had gotten earlier in the year about ways we can streamline and make the disclosure form process more efficient. So this is a step forward in that process. I just noticed that there was a quick question in the chat about when the API is going to be available for non-community solar disclosure forms. A form of an API is available currently for uploading information to create disclosure forms for DG projects. At this time, we haven't planned on a similar process to what we are doing for community solar, but I guess as we roll this out, we certainly could take stock of that in the future.
I believe there was also a question from the chat about what form of follow-up is required for the to-be-determined project specifications. So if you have a disclosure form, but you don't identify the project's particulars, what follow-up is required. And that's described, and I think it's 2E2 of the marketing guidelines, the Community Solar Marketing Guidelines. So I'd refer you to that document. There is a minimum project details description included in that, as well as some timing information.
All right, thanks. There was a question we received prior to the webinar as well about our customers who signed the new version of the disclosure form. and not yet placed on an energized project able to be placed on a project other than the one indicated on their signed disclosure form. So again, there are two options for the disclosure form, so there will be. One is identifying a project and the other is a to be determined project. If the disclosure form specifies a project and a different project ultimately is what the subscriber would like to subscribe to, then a new disclosure form would be required. Alternatively, if the disclosure form does not specify a project, then that project that the subscriber ultimately subscribes to needs to be identified downstream. It can be any project that is available at that point for the approved vendor.
Yeah, so really to follow up on that, I mean, disclosure forms generated prior to the release and implementation of this new disclosure form are effectively grandfathered in. And those disclosure forms did not have this alternative path for a TBD option. So it is only will be available as part of the new disclosure form. It does not change anything about previously issued disclosure forms.
All right, and what we're showing on the screen right now is the pages of that sample disclosure form that I mentioned earlier that we posted, announced yesterday, and that's available on the program website. So just a quick look at what it ultimately will look like. It's been shortened and it's a little bit more readable, hopefully a lot more readable, just to give you an idea of what it will look like. And I think we have another page that has the last two pages of the form. Yep, there we go.
I'd also note there in terms of the shortening of the form, the examples shown in those slides and in the template released yesterday were one where where the form continues to specify the project. If it's a TBD option, it shaves about another half page or more off of the length of the form. So in terms of the ongoing effort to streamline the information, that will be one step forward in making documents that are more user-friendly.
Thanks, Anthony. All right, as we turn to stakeholder feedback requests, I know that Anthony and Brian at the IPA had an interest in running through these particular slides.
Sure. So in late November, we issued 2 requests for stakeholder feedback. One around the project diversity considerations for community solar, which I'll talk about for a moment, and then also one about REC pricing. So I just want to reiterate that we are really looking forward to stakeholder feedback on this. The deadline for that feedback is December 21st. If you have not seen either of these requests, they're available on the ABP website on the updates, and we will be sending out a reminder about that deadline as well with links to the requests. This first one flows out of the proposals that we had included in our revised long-term plan about how we would handle community solar projects if new additional funding became available to allow us to open additional blocks of community solar capacity, where the model is that half of the projects, half of the capacity will be for projects that are currently on the wait list, and the other half of capacity will be allocated to projects selected through a process that is designed to increase the diversity of types of community solar projects. So our request for feedback is really attempt to take sort of the framework that was included in the long-term plan about how to consider this and really ask stakeholders to sort of drill down more and to give us feedback about how we can refine that process, make adjustments to it, and really turn that into a specific proposal. So again, we're really looking forward to feedback on that. Our expectation is once we get that in, we will hold a workshop in the new year to discuss that and then release a proposed process for it that will be more detailed and fleshed out for additional stakeholder feedback. Because we really want to make sure that we hear from people as we develop and refine this proposal. So if we go down to the next slide. Similarly, we also released a request for stakeholder feedback about REC prices. And this has sort of two levels of it. One would be the shorter term one, that should we be able to open additional blocks of capacity before we next revise a long-term plan, what revisions to those next block prices, what they could be. The second one is, as we'll get to a little bit later, we are beginning the process of preparing our next revised long-term plan, which would provide opportunity for maybe a more sort of step back and take a more fundamental revision of how we approach and model rec pricing. So we're seeking feedback on both sides, interested in particular, what are different considerations between small DG and large DG? What have we seen in terms of market conditions and changing factors? You know, we used NREL's CREST model as the starting point for when we developed the original rec prices for the original long-term plan. Now, but I think, again, this is an opportunity to potentially step back and say, is this really the right way of modeling rec prices and the various inputs and outputs to development considerations? One thing we're particularly interested in is continuing to look at the community solar small subscriber adder and how we may think about that going forward in the future as well. Similarly, we will plan to have additional workshops on these prices, and certainly any changes to prices will be announced prior to any block opening.
All right, thanks, Anthony. And now some information on the community solar waitlist publishing process. So per the revised long-term plan, approved vendors of community solar projects had to provide documentation earlier this year of having maintained site control and any applicable land use permits in order to maintain that project spot on the waitlist. So we conducted a thorough review of the documentation submitted for nearly 800 community solar applications. The Group A community solar waitlist ultimately decreased by 93 applications. So 93 applications were removed from the waitlist because they were no longer viable. And Group B decreased by 43 applications, and for a variety of reasons: approved vendor choice, site control wasn't maintained, or what have you. On December 4th, we announced the results of this. The revised waitlists are published on the Community Solar dashboard page on the ABP website and reflect these waitlist numbers. Now, one note that if an application gets removed from these waitlists, the list isn't reordered. So the waitlist number that a community solar project has stays with it. So if there are any gaps in the waitlist numbers that you see, so it goes from 1, 2, 4, number 3 has been withdrawn, and we didn't reorder the numbers to avoid confusion. And now I'll turn it back over to Anthony at the IPA for what's next for the adjustable block program.
Thanks, Alex. So I think obviously a key consideration on everybody's mind is, what is the status of the potential for future blocks opening up? So a few things on this front. We're currently in the process of reviewing the budget impacts as we see what the energization rates for ABP projects are, the impacts of COVID on project completion, et cetera, to get a better update on that. But fundamentally, we're in a situation where, absent any legislative actions, additional blocks will not be opening for the adjustable block program in 2021. And any blocks considered after that would be part of the update of our revised long-term plan. Now, a few things to note. Obviously, we don't know what future legislation might look like, what parameters it will give us, but in general, two things to consider. One would be that we had a process earlier this year of updating the rec delivery contract. If new blocks open, that new rec contract would be the contract used for those new blocks, and so it has a number of changes to it that we hope improve it. It's certainly, the contract has been shortened and simplified. There are now quarterly payment cycle, sorry, excuse me, monthly payment cycles on a quarterly basis rather than just one set of quarterly payment cycles. This is an attempt to allow projects as they get Part 2 verified to move towards payment more quickly. A number of other changes as well. The other thing to note is I mentioned the stakeholder feedback on rec prices. We will be, concluding that process other than the planned 4% decrease that was in the plan. And obviously it's premature at this point to say whether or not we will be considering changes to rec prices, but that's something that would be taken into consideration before opening additional blocks of capacity. So it may feel like we just finished revising the long-term plan. It certainly does for me, but we already are beginning to think about the next revised long-term plan because it is 2 years, every 2 years we update the plan. The statutory deadline for us to release the next draft plan is August 15th of 2021. So as we've done both for the revised plan and for the initial plan, we plan a variety of stakeholder feedback processes in the spring to sort of take feedback so that we can sort of, incorporate new ideas into that draft plan rather than putting out a draft plan that's just our ideas and then get feedback on it as well. That being said, we will, the whole concept is we put out that draft plan and there'll be opportunities for feedback on that draft plan prior to us filing with the Illinois Commerce Commission in the fall of next year to then be approved in February of 2022. The revising the long-term plan is really our opportunity to reconsider key program design considerations. So something like the distinction between small DG and large DG cutoff being 10 kW, that's in the law. So that is not something we could change in the long-term plan. The design of Group A and Group B, on the other hand, could be something that could be reconsidered. Some of the requirements for project applications would be another example of something that could be considered. So we really hope that, now that we've had the program running for a few years, this is an opportunity to step back and think, about, what's worked, what hasn't worked, and what we would like to change. So I'm looking forward to those feedback opportunities as we get into the spring of next year. And I suspect we probably will continue to be having to do these all virtually rather than in person. So we will be doing, webinars like this in the future.
Great. Thank you, Anthony. All right, moving on to stakeholder questions. We had put out a solicitation for some questions prior to the webinar and got a few responses. I'd like to tackle some of the ones that we haven't addressed just yet before we get to questions from other folks in real time. So one of the questions I see is about maintaining call logs for outgoing marketing or solicitation phone calls. And the question was about whether it applies only to cold calling. Not necessarily. Call logs do have to be maintained for any outgoing marketing or solicitation calls. Doesn't necessarily have to be cold calling. We also got some questions specific to the force majeure section of the rec contract. And Anthony and Brian, I don't know if you guys have that in front of you and are able to address those, or if we should run through that.
Sure. This is Brian. I believe the question was, since I don't believe others can see the questions, let's see if I can pull this up. It had to do with curtailments done by the utility. If there's a curtailment requirement, maybe as part of the interconnection agreement. And the general answer on this, I think the question is basically whether that sort of utility curtailment would constitute a force majeure event, or specifically whether the IPA.
EFS Energy, this is Janet. How can I help you?
Okay. Whether
Good.
the
how are you?
Could someone please mute?
Yeah.
From EFS.
So the question specifically concerned whether the IPA would concur with the utility that the utility's objection to the force majeure event. Anyway, the answer is basically that in a situation like this, we would need to see the arguments from both parties. If the seller was claiming a force majeure event, and under this hypothetical, the buyer is saying, no, we don't believe it's.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Objection.
I don't know what's going on. My phone messed up.
And we were to object to the existence of a force majeure.
Can you hear me now?
Then
I'm not really. Hold on one second.
EFS Energy, would you please mute yourself?
So, okay. We would need to see both the argument from the seller regarding the existence of the force majeure event and why the buyer believes it's appropriate to object to the force majeure event before offering our determination. So this is a long way of saying that we wouldn't want to prejudge a situation like this. We would want to see the arguments of both parties first. So generally speaking, it's the contract speaks for itself, the force majeure clause speaks for itself, and then the application of that language ultimately is something that's done based on the facts that are presented at that time.
All right, thanks, Brian. Taking a look at the questions that came in through the chat, I see one from Matthew Nelson about projects on the wait list, whether we should expect a drop in pricing of 4% for the next block, loss of the 75% small subscriber adder, or maintenance of other small subscriber adders, or whether those would be eliminated. I think that's all. Some of that is to be determined. The revised plan currently specifies the small subscriber adders that are in play right now. But for the next revised long-term plan, I think everything is on the table, and that's the purpose of the solicitation for stakeholder feedback. Is there a way to get a recording of this webinar or a copy of this presentation? Yes, it is being recorded, and it will be posted on the Adjustable Block Program website after this is all done, more than likely later today. Wasn't the ABP supposed to be ratepayer funded? I'm still being charged about $1 a month by my utility for renewable energy programs. Why this program ran out of funding when we're still paying for it each month?
Sure, I'd be happy to answer that. Yes, the Adjustable Block Program is ratepayer funded. The funds are collected from ratepayers every month, but if you think about a project and the pace at which a project is approved, there is a delay. That is not the same time as when payments are made for that program for its renewable energy credits after it has been energized. So funds are being collected because there are contractual obligations to pay to support projects that will come up in the future. And that is why we are currently in the situation we are, and in particular because of the structure of the Adjustable Block Program, where the payments are heavily front-loaded. There are significant payment obligations coming up in the next couple of years for the projects that have been accepted to date in the Adjustable Block Program, but have not yet been completed.
Yeah, one thing to add to that, this is Brian, is that if we were able to leverage funds that have previously been collected to pay for future contract obligations, future expenditures in the upcoming delivery years, we would be able to support more market activity. We'd be able to open up additional blocks to just the block program. A change in law is required for us to be able to leverage those funds indefinitely going forward, or for at least some period going forward, to cover those contract obligations. Absent the ability to leverage those previously collected funds, we end up in situations where expenditures exceed collections. So we don't have the ability to open up new blocks to just a block program. Now, we do have alternative compliance payments that have previously been collected that we can use to help manage any amount of expenditures exceeding collections. But what's really required is a legislative change. I know the trade associations, the solar trade associations have already bought into this. Certain advocacy organizations are as well, and the IPO would be very supportive of any change along these lines. But that's what we'd be looking for.
And before we get to the next question, I did want to jump back to one thing that I think we may have skipped over, which was making a point of encouraging the submission of any Part 2 applications that you can before the March 1 invoicing deadline. Anthony, I don't know if you can provide some more context on that.
Sure, it's basically that in terms of as we're looking at the program budgets and when funds will be available or constrained, the sooner projects can be energized and payments for them start being made, the better it is for the overall program budget. So we do encourage people to submit applications as soon as possible. I suspect it's in your interest as well, because that impacts when you get paid. But in particular, if we can, to the extent to which that can be focused on over the next few months, it will be beneficial for the program.
All right, let's turn back to the questions. I respectfully request that we have pricing as soon as possible for future blocks so we can accurately model prospective customers that we'll be adding to the DG waitlist for groups A and B, large and small. We're getting an area of extreme uncertainty in terms of when funding will be available. It would be very helpful to have block prices set so we can at least feel confident in our modeling for when funding does become available. This seems to me an important consumer protection.
So this is Brian. I think we understand that perspective. The requirement that we hold stakeholder feedback processes on rec prices is an extension of the Illinois Commerce Commission's administrative order in docket number 19-0995, approving our revised long-term plan. It's something we're required to do under that order. So we're following the administrative order, but we certainly understand the need for certainty, or the value that certainty provides at least, but we do have to go through this process. It is a requirement of that order.
All right, next question we've got is any insights on ABP requirements after COD? I am guessing that means after a project is part 2 submitted and verified, what happens at that point? There are still things that happen within the program, such as invoicing to the utility, payment. There is a rec delivery deadline. There are rec delivery requirements that are set out in the Schedule B to Exhibit A for what needs to be delivered every year. There are annual reports. Community solar projects have quarterly reports. So yes, there are additional requirements and milestones that happen even after part 2 to an application is submitted. Could we get further clarity on online reviews versus testimonials, please? Specifically, are online reviews used in marketing materials considered testimonials even if they are not solicited?
So I would like to weigh in on that. If I'm understanding the question correctly, if there's an online review posted to any one of those sorts of forums that the AV or designee then uses in their marketing efforts, that would be considered a testimonial. And the requirements around testimonials would apply.
All right. Let's see. Next question is clarification on the metering requirement changes. Is inverter monitoring still accepted? So I am in the process of trying to pull up the metering requirements since I don't have them committed to memory. They are in the program guidebook, so you can definitely check that. And if I can get this up, I can find it.
The only changes to the metering requirements were that prior to 2020, MRETs had stricter requirements for what sorts of meters were allowed than GATS did. And MRETs made changes that basically bring their metering requirements in line with the GATS metering requirements.
Okay, and specifically, projects under 10 kilowatts or under, I should say, can use inverter metering, and refurbished is okay. Anything over 10 kilowatts cannot use an inverter for monitoring.
Correct.
Or metering, rather. Okay, next question. If funding does become available legislatively, will projects that are waitlisted take precedence over new DG applicants applying for Block 4? Do DG projects added to the Group A or B waitlist ever expire?
I think it's an impossible question to answer in the sense that we do not yet know what future legislation may or may not direct us to do.
Yeah, it's possible, and we've seen, parties have drafts of legislation that might say take our existing 25% splits across different product categories and disregard that in favor of weighting one category versus another. So it's hard to say exactly what the legislation would direct us to do. But as it stands right now, Our proposal in the revised long-term plan, which would then apply should funding become available and there's no other requirements that attach, would prioritize waitlisted projects above new applicants. So if you're currently, say, on the large DG waitlist, those would be the first set of projects that would receive direct delivery contracts before any new applicants. And we do not presently, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, Alex or Anthony, we do not presently have, I think there would be no conditions predicate at present that would cause a DG project to be removed from the waitlist through some sort of expiration, correct?
That's correct.
That's correct.
I would imagine, though, that if we got to this situation, because, I mean, hopefully this will be solved sooner rather than later, we would do some sort of checking in with AVs to make sure projects are still live before moving forward with approving those projects. Alex described that right now that's the process for taking projects off the wait list, where the AV is given 10 days to decide if they want to do it or not. I would imagine we would do something similar as we open up new blocks and allow the wait list projects to move forward.
So the next question we've got is, could we get further insights into the thoughts and reasoning behind requiring previously signed customers to re-sign an enrollment package due to a change in farm assignment? The reason I ask is that COVID program shifts have required a majority of customers to be re-signed, which is an attrition issue during a time we cannot sell to a person in Illinois. Approved vendors didn't have the TBD option before, so it's likely we're asking customers to redo a process rather than simply notifying of their change their assignment. We'd love to hear more about that concerns here and the reasoning. So I think the question—
Is this a community solar question or distributed generation question? It's not clear from the way it was asked.
I think it would have to be community solar. I'm not sure.
Yeah, Jackie, if you're on the line, you can unmute yourself and perhaps provide some more color.
Oh, she answered in the chat, community solar.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm. We're implementing a new option for disclosure forms. So I think that's the sort of the simple reasoning, is that this is a new option we're making available. The disclosure form signed by a customer previously has listed on it the name of the project. So for that customer to move forward on a different project, then the disclosure form is not an accurate representation of the offer made to them.
Yeah, I think the distinction is really what's material, and if there's a material change as between the circumstances that were present when the customer initially sent the disclosure form versus what will actually ultimately happen with the customer. And if the customer has been told that the customer will be part of one project and is now being a part of another, then in our view, that's a material change that would require a new disclosure form to be executed, and that standardized information be delivered with accurate information on it. That's the thought process of it.
Hi, this is Jackie. Thanks so much for that explanation. That really helps. And just for a tad further clarity, am I understanding that the primary concern is the consumer protection of understanding they would be on the red farm versus the blue farm, and it being a necessity that is on the contract, on the disclosure form, as opposed to notifying the customer through the outlined IPA processes?
Well, the notification of the customer through the outlined IPA processes only takes effect if the customer is given a disclosure form that says your project will be determined. It's not something that would apply if the customer told you are part of this project. There isn't an option under the updated marketing guidelines if an approved vendor or their community solar provider were to tell the customer they're on the blue farm, that they could just notify the customer later that they're on the red farm. They're only able to utilize that process of customer notification independent of the disclosure form if TBD is what's disclosed in the initial disclosure form. So that's a little bit of a difference there.
Sure, and that makes sense. I would just raise for consideration that obviously the shifts and changes in project development that resulted from COVID and so forth was simply unforeseen. And so the typical ways that development is a moving goalpost is all the more so. And many approved vendors may be in a situation where a significant book of customers were originally assigned to a farm by their best estimation at that moment in time. That was pre-COVID, and that shifted, and customers could now be put on an earlier farm and receive the benefit of an energized program sooner, but would have to go through the additional steps of re-executing an enrollment package since that TBD wasn't available. And I think there could be significant attrition impact for approved vendors by results of a burdensome process, and would just simply raise for consideration that, you know, there could be ways to ensure the consumer protection and ensure consumer visibility into their farm assignment without asking for additional lift from the customer. You know, particularly if customers new to a program might say, well, you know, arguably, does it really matter to the customer if they're on farm, the blue farm or the red farm, or does it matter to them to be on the earliest energized farm?
So Jackie, this is interesting, and maybe there's really good and easy answers for this, but I guess I want to explore this a little bit further. From what we've seen with COVID, it has not caused attrition of community solar projects from the program. The projects that have dropped out, there's been a handful, have been because interconnection cost estimates have come back too high. I think in general, that's been the biggest factor. There wouldn't be a reordering, say, in an interconnection queue resulting from COVID. So I'm kind of curious how COVID would cause a reordering in project development, such that the blue farm is now online more quickly than the red farm, when previously we were assuming the red farm would be online more quickly, which is why the customer was going to be placed on, I forget exactly my example, whether it was the blue or red farm, but the opposite of the one that is now going to be online more quickly.
Sure. Yeah, no, I'm with you. And it's a good question. And, you know, I mean, we have seen that on our side. We have seen that development timelines shifted from what was originally anticipated due to either, you know, the farm needing to close for a period of time due to worker protection in a positive case or other scenarios. And there were just basic shifts of, you know, the farm that we thought might be second in line, for instance, is now fourth in line. And there were some rejiggering in those senses that didn't necessarily position us to place the what ended up being the correct, if you will, farm on a customer's disclosure form, and also being handicapped by having to put something and not having that TBD option at the time.
Thanks for that explanation. I think let's maybe follow up with us online. I'd be curious to know more about how that would work. I could think of a few ways in which that would happen, but you know, better to learn than to assume. So
yeah, no, I appreciate the willingness for the conversation, and yeah, we'll shoot you a note offline and maybe we can connect on that. We'd appreciate that.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thanks for that, Jackie. All right, next question we've got is, will projects not selected off the waitlist move to the new program in 2022? Sounds like that is a big, it depends.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
There is, sorry, I was on mute. There really isn't a new program. I mean, absent legislative changes, you know, that might say we're having a new program. What happens is every 2 years we update our long-term plan, which changes the parameters of the program. So the adjustable block program will continue in 2022. We may sort of say we're changing certain aspects of the program. We will try to make sure as we develop those proposals, we will consider continuity in that. So if there is, you know, let's say through the process, some significant new requirement gets added, once that takes effect, we would make sure that there's a way in which previously applied projects that maybe have not yet moved forward would be able to adjust and adapt to that changed requirement.
All right, next question we've got is, can you clarify that a community solar management company would need to be registered and as an approved vendor designee? Yes, they would. There is a new role as part of the designee registration process for a community solar subscriber agent, and that's what they would fall into. Next question is, what is the effective date by which approved vendor marketing activity must follow the updates included in the November 18th, 2020 Community Solar Marketing Guidelines?
So that's 45 days, which I believe is January 2nd. If my math is correct.
All right, next question. Is there any information on the status of new legislation that would allocate additional funds to the program that you can share? Is any legislation proposed? Any estimated timelines on when that might be reviewed and or approved?
So this is Brian. In addition to serving as our chief legal counsel at the IPA, I'm also a legislative liaison. And right now, I think that the big challenge is that the oxygen in the room down in Springfield is being taken up with other things. Obviously, COVID creates a barrier in that it creates disincentive against actual assembly on behalf of the General Assembly. So veto session, which are 2 weeks that occur after the election, where in theory the legislature is taking up bills that have been vetoed by the governor, although not exclusively, was canceled this year. That was 1 week was scheduled for mid-November, 1 week was scheduled for early December. There is talk, although at this point it's just talk about there being what's called lame duck session dates, which would occur before the new General Assembly is sworn in. And in the past, we've seen legislation pass during that period, including energy legislation passing during lame duck session days. Right now, we simply don't know. I think we're operating a little bit in the dark because there's obviously ongoing discussion around who will be the House Speaker for the next General Assembly. There's continued issues around the deferred prosecution agreement entered into by ComEd and that ongoing investigation. I think everyone would really like to see a bill pass that frees up additional funding available for solar programs, and we've provided feedback and proposed language, not formally but informally, to different parties through this process. And we'd love to see something like that move forward, but we do not have any real estimates on when that might happen, or even when the General Assembly will be meeting again.
Thanks, Brian. All right, the next question we've got is there a resource showing the energization status of existing community solar blocks? That is not a metric that we currently have posted.
Well, we have it indirectly. We have project application reports on the website, which shows projects that have been approved, projects not yet energized, and projects energized. So there's some raw data. It's perhaps not as distilled as maybe the questioner is asking.
That's fair.
That being said, I believe, is it 2 or 3 community solar projects have been energized to date?
Just 2, yeah.
Just 2, with I think 1 currently undergoing review.
Right.
Just basically every other community solar project has requested an extension.
All right, next question. If more blocks are added from the legislators at the next General Assembly, what is the timeline on funding being available from the newly passed blocks?
I think Brian just answered that, so go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say this probably depends on what's in that legislation, but under the long-term plan, not because of necessarily arguments that we made in the proceeding approving the long-term plan, but due to a prioritization that was chosen under that plan, there is a utility scale procurement and a brownfield site solar procurement would be prioritized above opening new blocks in the adjustable block program if funding were made available, all else being equal. Whether we could then concurrently open adjustable block program blocks is something that I think we'd have to consider. Whether that would require formal clarification from the commission is something we'd have to consider. But we do have that little hurdle of adjustable block program being lower in the prioritization than what the IPA had originally proposed. So if we can work through that, then there shouldn't be much of a lag at all. Or if the bill that passes directs us to open blocks of the adjustable block program first or concurrently with conducting those other activities, then again, we will be opening up them fairly quickly thereafter. But without knowing what's in that bill, it's hard to say at this point.
Next question is it beneficial to the program to energize systems by March, or is there a deadline or requirement there?
Every project has its own energization deadline. The desire to see as much energized by March as possible is something that's beneficial to the program, because that then gives us more clarity on the payment for RECs and the basically cash flow of the program. So much, so many of the original energization deadlines, well, for community solar and for large DG have changed because of extensions requested. Approved vendors frequently, I think, ask for extensions that gave them the time they needed, conservatively needed to complete their projects, while in fact can complete those projects hopefully faster than that. So what we're really interested in is seeing, getting a better sense of what is completed, what commitments are being paid out. But again, each project has its own requirement. That request I made was just to help us better understand where we stand overall as a program.
All right, the next question we've got is, can you clarify your bullet point stating that the long-term plan authorizes the IPA to adjust REC pricing by up to 25%? Does that mean that a new potential REC block would be priced with a 25% increase or decrease from the previous block price?
To clarify, this is a provision that comes out of the enabling statute that allows the IPA to adjust REC prices by up to 25% without having to go back to the Illinois Commerce Commission for approval of those changes. I believe there's a requirement for stakeholder feedback, which is exactly what we're, the process that's underway. So that's the parameters that are laid out in the law. That does not necessarily mean we will change the prices, but that's the parameter, that's the band in which we can do it through a simplified process. And again, I would encourage, if you have thoughts about REC prices and where they should go, please respond to our request for comments. The more information, market data, et cetera, we can get to help inform those considerations, the better.
Next question up is, other than the meter requirements for small subscribers, are there any restrictions on other meter classes subscribing to a community solar farm? There are no specific metering requirements for community solar projects. In the new version of the program guidebook on page 37 of the PDF, there's a table that lists the metering requirements, which can give all the detail that you may like to have. Different classes would be small DG, which is smaller projects, which is 10 kilowatts or under, projects that are above 10 kilowatts and less than 25 kilowatts, and then projects that are above 25 kilowatts. Next up, we have for community solar waitlist projects. If a project has followed the program requirements that have existed in the past 3+ years, including having maintained and continuing to maintain site control, it sounds like the revised long-term plan proposes to push back or at least dilute the projects that literally followed the rules of the program. These projects were reviewed and approved by the IPA and have significant dollars and significant time from all parties invested to date.
So this is Brian. I can go ahead and take this one. We had proposed as part of the long-term renewable resource procurement plan to take half of any block 5 that opened up for community solar and utilize the existing community solar waitlists for that block, and then half of it will be subject to this project diversity criteria. And the reason why we made that proposal was because as we looked at the portfolio of community solar projects that apply to the program, we felt that there was a disconnect between, I think, external expectations of community solar, which is that we would have an array of projects of different sizes, some of which were more community-based, some of which might be located in urban and suburban areas, versus just the more agrarian, remote, large-size projects that we've seen participate in the program. We believe that diversity in community solar project type has value. As a consequence, we propose that half of a new block that opened would feature projects selected based on that criteria. The effect of that is to dilute the amount of contract awards that would otherwise go to waitlisted projects. We understand that, and we're still accommodating waitlisted projects through half of any block. But ultimately, and I think we see this quite a bit through some of the questions that have come up, the term community solar farm is not used in the law. The term farm is nowhere to be found in the law. The way in which community solar was discussed in the halls of the General Assembly and a number of other conversations that we've been a party to is a little bit different than I think the way community solar is developed, which has been in larger, more centralized projects. And there are undoubtedly efficiencies created by those projects, but it doesn't mean that that has to be the only type of community solar that's supported in Illinois. And our efforts to introduce project diversity selection criteria is an effort to try to have a more diverse portfolio of projects in Illinois. We think that has value. This issue was litigated before the Illinois Commerce Commission across 2019 and 2020, and the Illinois Commerce Commission ultimately agreed with us. So that is the process that is not only in our long-term plan, but which was expressly addressed through an administrative process over 2019 and 2020 and is now codified through administrative order.
All right, next question is, has the waitlist for the small group A been posted? No, it has not yet been posted, so you haven't missed anything. We'll be getting that out shortly and announcing, so stay tuned for that. Next question is, when should we expect the final revised REC contract to be available publicly? Did the IPA reject the proposed provision for projects less than 10 kilowatts AC to be able to transfer collateral payments from a canceled project to a newly applied project? Based on the nature of the residential market, this can result in significant funds forfeited as projects cancel. This issue becomes increasingly harmful as AVs attempt to get projects submitted expeditiously as we approach small-scale capacity allocation.
We have not yet published the final REC contract based upon it, but I believe that at this point in time, we are not considering that proposal.
Okay, the next question we've got is, how do we report companies that are going door to door still? In the past few months, I know of several companies that have been mentioned by my customers who knocked on their door or did an in-person meeting. Any instances you hear of companies going door to door violating program marketing requirements, please inform the program administrator. Our email address is admin@illinoisavp.com and our phone number is 877-783-1820. It'll be on the next slide, the very last slide of this presentation. Please reach out to us. There we go. Thank you. To let us know about this. We investigate any and all instances of anyone going door to door. Some have happened already, and there's a disciplinary actions report that's published on the AVP website that includes some suspensions of program participants that have been found to be in violation of this particular requirement. So Brian, you had something to add?
Yeah, one point of clarification I want to make there is that there's a difference between customers knocking on doors and in-person meetings insofar as it is permissible under our COVID-19 related marketing guidelines to have an in-person meeting with the customer if the customer in advance expressly acquiesces to that in-person meeting. Our concern is initiating person-to-person contact with individuals without their express acquiescence. Effectively, you're subjecting them to in-person interactions that they have not agreed to, which, given the nature of the global health pandemic that we're currently in, just seems like it's not advisable at all from a public health standpoint and risks undermining public confidence in the program. So there is potentially a difference between those two scenarios. Obviously, the door knocking would be flatly impermissible, but an in-person meeting is not itself necessarily not permitted if it's been expressly agreed to in advance by that customer.
So for example, if you have a telephone conversation with a customer, you could then set up a subsequent in-person meeting. I think that'd probably be the simplest solution.
Yeah, and ideally, much of this can be done over Zoom or other platforms. So ideally, and I think from the company standpoint, it's probably in your best interest as well to try to limit the amount of in-person interactions that take place. But that is not itself a violation of the marketing guidelines if the customer says, yes, that's fine, I'm willing to meet in person at this date and this time.
That's a good clarification. Thank you. Another question came in. Sorry if I missed this. Would storage be able to be added to the program? I expect that it would be complex to add into the mix and be required to make a change in the law. Should we do a stakeholder feedback request for this?
At a high level, let me answer that at a high level, and then maybe someone from Incline can talk specifically about specific projects. Currently, Illinois does not have any explicitly defined storage goals or targets or programs in the way we do to support new renewables or energy efficiency. So ultimately, and I know some of the legislative proposals that are out there do have a variety of different ways of beginning to create some state policies around storage. That being said, some solar installations are beginning to include storage. We do have guidelines within the program guidebook about storage as part of DG systems. And I believe the key concept is ensure, and I am not an engineer, so I may have the precision a little off here, is that the storage has to be configured in such a way that it cannot be filled with electricity from the grid. It has to be truly renewable energy stored, generated by the solar panels, stored in the storage, in the batteries, and then discharged.
This is Kevin Quilliam here on the storage. If you have any questions about a particular storage setup, just go ahead and send us an email or give us a call and we can go over that with you.
All right, we've had one more question come in. We completely support any program that supports diversity and inclusion. For the future of this program, which has been in place for years, are the decision makers considering adding a new block or blocks of capacity for a diversified community solar projects, which could be based on landowner host requirements and/or subscriber-based participation requirements? This should still maintain the published community solar waitlist as long as those projects continue to follow the rules of the program.
Again, I think the various legislative proposals that have been introduced, some of them do have new ideas about community solar. All of those currently are being discussed. What will end up in any final legislation, I think, as Brian has extensively described, is to be determined.
Yeah, what we are considering at present is reflected in the existing long-term plan. We'll hold stakeholder processes, assuming there isn't some sort of change legislatively that redirects where we end up going. We'll be holding stakeholder processes this spring and summer where parties can provide feedback if they have a different vision in mind. And then ultimately it'll be subject to, again, an approval process before the ICC across 2021 and 2022.
And that is the last question that we have received. So thank you for all those questions. Great points to clarify. If anything else comes up, feel free to reach out to us, the program administrator at admin@illinoisabp.com or 877-783-1820. Brian and Anthony, any parting thoughts?
I would just like to thank everyone for participating today and for everyone who's been participating in the program over the last several years. Just really to thank you for all your efforts in increasing the solar market in Illinois. We obviously have some challenging times ahead. We look forward to the issues we're dealing with being resolved and being able to expand and improve the program in the coming years.
And on behalf of Incline, the program administrator as well, I thank everyone for your time today. Thanks for joining us for a little bit, and